Buenos días, bienvenidos y bienvenidas a esta nueva actividad del Festival Puerto de Ideas Valparaíso, que este año celebra su 10º aniversario gracias al apoyo de Colbún, Copeuch, Fundación Mar Adentro y el Ministerio de las Culturas. Mi nombre es Francisco Aravena, yo soy periodista, y a continuación Misha Glenny, periodista inglés, experto en crimen organizado y ciberseguridad, va a reflexionar sobre la influencia que ejercen los líderes de las naciones más poderosas del mundo sobre la pandemia, las armas de destrucción masiva, la crisis climática y la hiperdependencia, en los sistemas informáticos en red. Luego de eso vamos a tener una conversación sobre sus principales planteamientos. Espero que lo disfruten. Misha, how are you?
I'm fine, Francisco. Thanks very much. Buenos dias. And it's really nice to be here in spirit in Valparaíso, if not in person. So I'm going to talk initially for about half an hour or so about what really, I suppose, is the sort of overall global situation that we face at the moment, and what the challenges we face are. So I'm going to start by talking a little bit about 2016. 2016 was a real turning point for the world in many ways. We saw the election of Duterte in the Philippines. We saw the vote in the United Kingdom, the Brexit vote, which led to the UK departing from the European Union. We saw the coup in Turkey, an attempted coup against Erdogan. And President Erdogan then used that coup in order to assert a series of very authoritarian measures in the country. We saw a hardening of the position over refugees of Viktor Orbán, the Hungarian Prime Minister. We saw the consolidation in power of Narendra Modi, the Prime Minister of India. And then, of course, in November 2016, we saw the election of Donald Trump. Also at this time, we saw the explosion of the corruption crisis, Lava Jato in Brazil, which of course affected large parts of South America, particularly through the company Odebrecht, which had interests all over the continent. And what was interesting about these events is it consolidated the power of people who I call the Iron Men, and I've written a podcast called "The Rise of the Iron Men," and I was thinking about writing a book about the Iron Men, but the more I thought about it, I came to the conclusion that what was interesting and what was important was not the Iron Men themselves. There's been so much written about Bolsonaro, about Trump, about Boris Johnson, Viktor Orbán, and so on, Erdogan, Rodrigo Duterte. I thought, actually, they are a symptom, a manifestation of a crisis, not the actual cause. And so I started trying to decide why things had deteriorated so dramatically over the space of one generation, really. And how we, by the year 2020, 4 years after the Iron Men came to power in so many countries, 4 years after that, we face such huge challenges in the world with such weak leadership, or poor leadership, perhaps is a better description. And those 4 challenges, as you outlined in your introduction, Francisco, are the pandemic, which is upon us. Then there is the weapons of mass destruction, and the fact that really rather unnoticed over the past 10 years or so, a lot of the regulatory systems which keep weapons of mass destruction in check have either fallen out of disuse or have been ignored. And so weapons of mass destruction are actually a problem for us. Then the third thing is our over-dependency on networked computer systems. And that over-dependency means that if those systems go wrong, they can have absolutely devastating effect on our society. And finally, of course, the big one, which is climate change, because if we don't do something about climate change, then it threatens the destruction of species, not only millions of animal and plant species around the world, but of course, the human race as well. And these four huge challenges come at a point when we have these populist leaders, most of whom ignore the major challenges and threats facing humanity. And so what I wanted to know is how come at a point where we need decent leadership so badly, we have failed in this way. What happened in the past 30 years to make our prospects look so grim? And my starting point is always 1989. That was the revolutions in Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union, the end of communism, because it was a moment of such optimism. So I put together a little bit of a film, which I'm going to share with you to explain where that took us to. So here we go.
I covered all the revolutions in Eastern Europe as a BBC correspondent. It was a moment pregnant with great optimism and opportunity, where liberal democracy, so-called European values, and aspirations of world peace appeared to reign supreme. But it wasn't just communism that collapsed when the Iron Curtain fell. For several years, the state suffered a heart attack as well, and while it was on life support, another change was taking place. The planned economy of the Soviet Union was being replaced by the free market capitalist economy of the victorious West. Freedom, revolution, the end of history. Well, that's what we were promised. That's what the American thinker Francis Fukuyama told us was coming, and many believed him. The end of history. Well, 1989 certainly was the end of a historical epoch, one which had begun exactly 200 years earlier with the French Revolution. But I'm afraid, my friends, there is no end to history. And the birth of a new epoch is always difficult, dangerous, and bloody. So what went wrong? Picture this. Two Russian entrepreneurs at the dawn of capitalism. How exactly do they go about making a deal? Господин Ivanov, I am businessman from Magnitogorsk. I wish to sell you some widgets at 3 rubles apiece. Здравствуйте, господин Klimov. I like your widgets, but please only 2 rubles and 50 kopecks. Господин Ivanov, I am cheating myself with 2.50. Shall we go to commercial tribunal to settle our dispute? Господин Klimov, I would like, but there is no functioning court system in Russia. The state has had heart attack, remember. However, I have friends. They belong to so-called privatized law enforcement agency. Ужас. Ну я тоже. Perhaps my privatized law enforcement agency can arrange a fair price with yours. What sociologists refer to as privatized law enforcement agencies, we call the mob or the mafia. But whatever you think about them, they were indispensable for the emergence of a market system in Eastern Europe. I was very privileged to be invited to the inaugural annual general meeting of Bulgaria's nascent capitalist class, and I treasure this photographic memento of the event. Now, those of you old enough to remember the Cold War might recall how the Bulgarians used to win stacks of medals in the wrestling and weightlifting categories at the Olympics. They were communist heroes and they enjoyed many material privileges. So what were they going to do after they lost all their subsidies in 1989? You see, Bulgaria, like all East European countries, was flat broke. So broke, in fact, that Bulgaria had to sack 14,000 policemen. Now, if the state has collapsed and your economy is heading south, probably the last cohort you want coming onto the jobs market are 14,000 men and women whose chief skills are surveillance, smuggling, sabotage, and murder. But that's what happened across Eastern Europe, and many of them joined up with the weightlifters to find employment with privatized law enforcement agencies. So you see, from the very beginning, the free market and capitalism in Eastern Europe was entwined with organized crime. It wasn't long before this culture of crime migrated to the internet, and in the year 2000, a group of Ukrainians in Odessa launched the website that would revolutionize cybercrime. Welcome to the wonderful world of Carter Planet. What you're watching now is an internet ad that's 20 years old, incredibly sophisticated for the time, and it drew thousands of users to carterplanet.com, which was a sort of Facebook for criminals. You could purchase the latest viruses to use against your enemies, take tutorials in the latest cybercrime techniques, buy and sell fake IDs and documents. But above all else, you could trade in stolen credit and debit card data. The reason why Carter Planet was so important, though, was because they came up with the answer to the conundrum that until then had baffled the bad guys on the web. And that was, how can I do business with this person when I know that he's a criminal, and so he's axiomatically untrustworthy? So the administrators of Carter Planet thought up the escrow system. If you wanted to sell, say, the data of 5,000 credit cards, you would send these digitally to the escrow officer at Carter Planet. Meanwhile, the potential purchaser would send e-gold, an early digital currency. The escrow officer would then send out at random some of the data to his friends in Toronto, Wellington or Rio to use at local ATMs, and if this worked, which it usually did, then the escrow officer and friends would keep this as a fee before releasing the data to the purchaser and the e-gold to the vendor. This led to an explosion of crime over the internet, and this decade was known as the Champagne era for carders.
So Russian oligarchs, Russian mafia and Russian cyber criminals were all making a shed load of cash, a lot of money. But remember, they're very smart people who know their own history well. And before long, they knew that some strong man or other, like President Putin, would come back to put the Russia house in order. So they had to hide their cash somewhere, as the last thing the oligarchs and criminals wanted was for the new guy to get his grubby little paws on it. And this is where the West comes into the story. More to the point, this is where the Western banking system comes into the story, because since President Nixon had detached the dollar from the gold standard in the early 1970s, successive presidents, since President Nixon detached the dollar from the gold standard in the early 1970s, successive presidents and British prime ministers had been bending to the requests of financial institutions to loosen up our regulatory systems, exchange rates, capital ratios, the merging of retail with investment banking. And you combine this with the centuries-old mechanism of using offshore tax havens like the Cayman Islands or the British Virgin Islands, and organized crime quickly realized it had found its very own philosopher's stone, a system to transform filthy lucre into pristine gold. So in the 1990s and the 2000s, the West just didn't care. London and New York were in a deregulatory race to become the financial capital of the world, and they both turned a blind eye to the origins of the lucre sloshing through the system. Financial institutions and Western politicians thought that, like the Russians, they had found their very own philosopher's stone, a way of transforming everything into gold without any risk at all. No return to boom or bust, in the words of Gordon Brown, Britain's former Treasury Minister. That all came to a juddering halt in 2008. It wasn't until 2008 and the financial crash that I began to realize how important the issues of scale and proportion were in the world. After the Wall Street crash of 1929, it took a full 14 months before Austria's Kreditanstalt became the first major casualty of the collapse of Wall Street. In 2008, by contrast, it was just 4 days before almost every major bank around the world was staring into the abyss of global economic meltdown and collapse. So what was powering this?
As I observed the speed with which the financial crash affected the entire world, I kept thinking about this chap. Vitruvian Man, Leonardo da Vinci's famous sketch that solved a conundrum from classical Rome about how to square a circle. The diagram also posed and answered a number of other philosophical, mathematical and biological questions. The physical centre of Vitruvian Man was his belly button, but the notional centre was the idea of proportion. The human form, God's most consummate creation, was fashioned to geometric perfection. Together with our minds, human scale had evolved to enable us to best prosper physically, materially, and spiritually as we moulded our environment according to our own proportions. Now, when Da Vinci first drew Vitruvian Man, many Renaissance philosophers still adhered to the idea that humans stood in the middle of a hierarchy, the great chain of being, which ordered life from base minerals to God in heaven. Some, however, argued that God had given humans the requisite tools precisely in order to climb up the great chain of being and even to aspire to a godlike status. Industrialization in the 19th century began both that remarkable ascent as well as the distortion of our relationship to scale. Our striving was a double-edged sword, a Promethean exploration for knowledge and power over nature. Some of the benefits were immense, most notably the staggering increasing longevity we've experienced in the last 2 centuries. Some, like climate change, we weren't aware of until long after we'd first triggered the process. Some, like the unfettering of the immense power of nuclear, were awe-inspiring and terrifying at the same time. Yet even these monumental developments were processes that many of us, especially if we enjoyed access to education, could understand, at least theoretically. From the 1980s, science and technology moved into complex areas at such a speed that they began to spring the boundaries of even theoretical comprehension for most humans, individually or collectively. Everything has increased, expanded, or accelerated in such a way that we can no longer keep track of it.
Just as the banks couldn't keep track of what was going on in 2008 because technology was critical both to the intrinsic financial crisis and the speed with which it spread from New York across the world. The heart of the crash, credit default swaps and collateral mortgage obligations, the subprime securitization vehicles that had enabled banks to leverage debt way beyond their ability to repay it. Now, these vehicles, the CDSs and the CMOs, were managed by algorithms. No single financial institution had the least oversight into exactly how much debt they were carrying. But just like Dr. Frankenstein, they were unable to tame the monster once unleashed. And money just started flowing automatically out of banks across the world without anyone having even to press a button. On this occasion, government intervention, often improvised, narrowly saved us from economic and social Armageddon. We were literally hours away from a complete breakdown of human society. So as we sought to emulate God, we suddenly found ourselves loitering outside the gates of hell. Disoriented and frightened, we were losing our relationship to proportion and to human scale. So that government intervention that took place in 2008, it staved off the worst catastrophe, but it could not prevent the opening of profound divisions and ruptures within and between states. So you had popular anger with banks, politicians, journalists, the super rich. All this has been growing as the real life consequences of the financial crash have come home to roost. And let me throw into that mix the Internet of Things, machine to machine learning, artificial intelligence, quantum computing. I want to be perfectly plain here. I am not a technophobe. On the contrary, I've been a computer and internet enthusiast for a long time, but technology is morally neutral. We are the problem. And this is one central point to my remarks. The exponential increase which we are about to witness in the power of technology and our dependence on it coincides with rapidly growing domestic and geopolitical instability around the world. And it is that coincidence that is the real danger. This coincidence is shaping the threat environment more than any other phenomenon. And here's my second central point, the Vitruvian paradox, as I call it. Russians identified very early on that humans were the primary vulnerability when it came to computer security and cybercrime. Well, when we get to the Internet of Things, the primary vulnerability will no longer be humans, but machines, and the absence of human oversight. So for 2 decades, humans have been the problem when it comes to network computer systems, but now it is the absence of humans monitoring those systems which is going to threaten us. Now, in the relatively simple world of cybercrime, we can see the implications of replacing Vitruvian principles of human scale and proportions with, excuse me, with the massive techno scale. But what if we move into the really sensitive area of state-to-state relations? And this is where we have to be at our most vigilant. On October the 27th, 1962, we were told we had entered the most dangerous day in history. This was the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Cuban Missile Crisis was so dangerous that the Americans and the Russians became freaked out about it. They came so close to wiping out the entire planet that they decided to replace confrontation with cooperation through a series of landmark treaties establishing, excuse me, establishing the rules of the road with nuclear power. And this system worked. Well, it worked up to a point, because in September 1983, a Russian satellite detected a grave anomaly as it mapped the United States. It thought that it saw a nuclear weapon coming to the Soviet Union. The computers processing the data checked this 30 times, and 30 times they said, yes, the Americans have launched a nuclear missile at us. So it then automatically alerted the nuclear command bunker that 5 missiles with nuclear warheads loaded were heading to Russia. Now, if artificial intelligence had been in command at that point, Russia would have launched a counterattack and we would have been destroyed. Fortunately, the human in charge, Stanislav Petrov, made the right call and said this was a false alarm. And he was proved right. Reflections off the sun had hit the cloud tops and fooled the satellites. But in cyber at the moment, although in nuclear we have systems of regulation, in cyber there are no rules of the road, nor is there any sign of the 3 major cyber superpowers, Russia, China, and the US, coming to an agreement anytime soon on this issue. It's no coincidence that since the Ukraine's electric grid went down in December 2015 and after an attack by Russia, these attacks on critical national infrastructures are growing. So if big players squabble and argue, it opens up the cracks for freelancers, fellow travelers, criminal groups, contracted by states maybe. So we've already seen before the Internet of Things how much damage can take place because of computer networks. Are we going to have to experience a Cuban Missile Crisis in cyber before everyone comes to their senses and we start having some rules of the road? We'll have to wait and see. So that is one of the 4 horsemen that we are now seeing riding across the planet. The pandemic we've already seen. Weapons of mass destruction are a permanent threat. But it is really ultimately climate change that is so important. And that is why leadership is critical. It is simply unbelievable that the man leading the most powerful nation on the earth, at least possibly until January, we'll have to wait and see what happens between now and January, is a climate change denier. This is just so shocking that science, rational debate and thought no longer has sufficient energy in the greatest democracy in the world to persuade the president that what he is saying is deeply and utterly untrue. Until we recognize that these 4 challenges are global challenges, and the pandemic proves it beyond any doubt, and that we can only solve these problems as one single world, then I'm afraid the population of the earth is under real threat. We have to do something to change this. And with that, I think I probably depressed you enough for one day. And so I'll hand back to Francisco.
Thank you very much, Misha. Yeah, it's you deliver that as a joke, probably a more serious statement. I wanted to start by asking you a historic question, because you said the starting point of at least your narrative in 1989. But have you studied or looked at prior moments in history that could compare to today?
I have, and that's why I use the issue of Vitruvian Man and Leonardo da Vinci, because it comes right in the middle of the Renaissance. You have this extraordinary moment between 1517, which is when Luther nailed his 1997 theses to the door of the church in Wittenberg in Germany, and leading to the explosion of the Reformation. Between 1517 and 1534, you had extraordinary events. Just a few years after Luther, you had Cortez's meeting with Montezuma in Mexico. You had the Ottoman Empire in Europe conquering Belgrade and then moving into Hungary. You had the sack of Rome, so the home of the Catholic Church was destroyed by imperial troops, and then you had England leaving the Catholic Church and becoming de facto a Protestant nation. And you had Denmark and Sweden also becoming Protestant nations. So for the first time, a split in the church leads to a political division as well. And this was in an incredibly short space of time. The consequences of that division, however, played out over the next 100 years and culminated in the early 17th century in the 30 Years' War in Europe, which was one of the most devastating wars we've ever experienced. It was essentially a religious war, so devastating that at the end of it, states agreed that they would no longer use religion as a reason to go to war. But during that period, you had incredible expansion as well. You had the first globalization, whereby you had trade of taking slaves from Africa to South America, to the Caribbean, and to the what became later on the United States, the North American colonies. Wood, sugar, molasses, rum, all this was brought back to Europe. So you had the first globalization and the beginnings of modern European history in Central and South America and North America. All this took place really over a period of 2 centuries, from 1450, or the 1450s when Gutenberg invented printing, through to the end, 2 centuries later, of the 30 Years' War. Now, what we're seeing now, and this is why I talk about scale and proportion, is that in a very short space of time, we're seeing the emergence of these deep divisions, social divisions. We see it in every country we look at, but we are also seeing technology accelerating at a rate that we've never experienced before. And this is what I mean about human beings being unable to grasp and understand the rate of change. We have never had change at this rate. And although we have 5 centuries of learning and understanding about science since the Reformation, it appears that we are equally unable to manage social divisions, inequalities of wealth, inequalities of states, and so on and so forth. So I think the Renaissance is a very instructive period for us.
Mm-hmm. And of course, social divisions and inequalities are leading to several conflicts all over the world. And this have an impact on the political processes, of course. We've seen that in several societies, this country as well, but we are very, very much aware of that in case of, for instance, the United States, where polarization is part of that, and where you have foreign powers trying to exploit them, right? And how do you think we should understand the interest of Russia being a state actor, in many ways behaving as an anti-systemic non-state actor for the other countries?
Yes, I mean, that's a very interesting question, Francisco, and very well put, because what it does is it uses the techniques of non-state actors like criminals in order to try and influence or disrupt other political processes. The situation of Russia is very, very clear. It has a tiny economy compared to the United States. Its economy is a tenth of the size of the United States, and it is over-dependent on one particular industry. That's its hydrocarbon energy resources, gas and oil, and so its influence has reduced very dramatically in the world. It remains a great power for one reason and one reason alone, and that is it has many thousands of nuclear warheads, a legacy, of course, from the Soviet period. And so that keeps it up there with the other big players. But Russia looks at the United States, it looks at the European Union, it looks at China, and in terms of the US and China, it understands completely that it does not have the economy and the resources to maintain parity with China and the US. And so it has to engage with its potential or actual enemies in a different way. So what it started doing was it was looking at the West and saying, well, we can't compete with them economically, but what are their vulnerabilities? What are their problems in the West? And they saw very clearly that the West was suffering really serious political difficulties as a consequence of 2008, the financial crash, with the rise of populism. And one thing that the Russians are very good at, and this is also a legacy of the Soviet period, is they have a lot of extremely good computer engineers and mathematicians, physicists, and so on. And so they thought, well, we can start using social media, using fake news, and using hacking. We can disrupt the West and really make their life difficult and therefore weaken them simply by playing around with the internet. And it's very, very cheap. It doesn't cost us anything at all. And so Russia becomes a problem, and the West becomes more insecure and becomes weaker. So it's to Russia's advantage. I have to say, though, that in the long term, Russia is not a strategic enemy of the West, because it simply won't be able to sustain its power because of its economic problems. The really, really big issue is China, and you know, in South America, you're all too well aware of the economic influence that China can bring to bear on countries, and China is doing this all over the world. What's really frightening for me about the Chinese American relationship and its deterioration under both Trump and Xi Jinping is that technology and internet technology, artificial intelligence is at the very heart of this dispute. So we have Huawei, we have TikTok, and so on and so forth. And that, for me, is, you know, these countries need to cooperate. We have to find a way of cooperating with China. Otherwise, we will be moving to some sort of dangerous conflict.
But before moving to that, I wanted to stick for a while on Russia because since you point their vulnerabilities and you state that they won't sustain this for a long time in the long term, what or who do you think it would fill its vacuum? I mean, do we have a potential danger there? When a big power collapses, or maybe not collapse, but maybe just fading in influence, of having other, not so big state actors, but copying and learning from Russia's playbook?
Yeah, well, there are certainly a lot of people learning from Russia's playbook. Interestingly, when I talk about the Iron Men, people like Trump, Duterte, Modi, Johnson, Orbán, Erdogan, Bolsonaro, I'm talking about people who were elected democratically in largely free and fair elections. And what they then try and do is they start undermining the democratic institutions which got them elected in the first place. And we have a textbook example of that going on at the moment with Donald Trump trying to stop the results in some of the results in the US presidential election. Now, Putin, with the best will in the world, you can't really describe him as having been elected in free and fair elections. Nonetheless, it's really interesting to see how obsessed all the democratically elected Iron Men are with Putin. They think Putin is a master of everything. They all want to be like Putin. I would also say there's another character who conforms to this model, and that is Benjamin Netanyahu in Israel as well. And they all believe that Putin has some sort of mystical secret which maintains him as such a master of maintaining domestic control, but also playing such a good hand when it comes to tactical issues in places like the Middle East and Europe. And he has expanded Russian power into Africa, to some extent into Venezuela, although not very much into Venezuela. But with a very, very weak hand, he plays it very strongly, and the strong men just love this guy.
You've said that we have to get China to collaborate in some way, but I guess there are two questions there. First, collaborate with whom? Since we are witnessing deterioration of the alliances, it's not so easy to say, even to say Europe, like one Europe, or the West, right? So who should be the actor, like calling China and making or trying that collaboration with China? And I move to the second question. It seems that we, quote unquote, I mean, as a Western world, have tried both collaboration and lately confrontation with China, or at least some actors. Do we have a clue of how to make them to collaborate?
Yeah, well, it's a very good question again, Francisco. Look, obviously, the primary relationship is between Washington and Beijing. There's no question about that. If Biden is finally confirmed as president, which is, when we're talking, is what it looks like it's going to be, then I don't think you'll see a hugely dramatic shift in American policy towards China, because actually it's one of the few policies that Trump has developed which has some measure of bipartisan support from the Democrats as well. But I think you will get a very different style, and you will see Biden's team, foreign policy team, trying at least to establish cordial relations so they can start to work out where you can cooperate. There are obvious things, for example, on climate change. As we know, the United States has just pulled out officially, has confirmed its pullout from the Paris Accords. And the first thing that Biden will do is go back into the Paris Accords. And that is something which China is interested in cooperating with the United States and everyone else, because China recognizes that climate change and pollution are a big, big problem. And even though they don't always do as much as they might, they clearly are engaged with the issue. So that's one thing. Iran is a second thing, which is absolutely huge for the world. Of course, in an act of supreme vandalism, Trump trashed the agreement with Iran on nuclear. This was such a bad move. But China, I'm sure, would welcome a switch, and I think Biden will switch this, because what you're going to see is Biden is going to have a lot of problems at home because he doesn't control the Senate, or at least as we're talking, it doesn't look as though he's going to control the Senate. So that means domestic policy will be really difficult. But what he can make a lot of progress on is foreign policy and restoring America's relations in the world, because the United States may be divided down the middle about Trump, but the rest of the world certainly is not. We all recognize, or at least the majority of the rest of the world recognize Trump as a complete menace. So with that, you'll have the basis, at least for the creation of a dialogue between the United States and China. Now, Europe in this will play a very important role, particularly the European Union. The United Kingdom, by deciding to leave the European Union, has essentially it's reduced its relevance in international affairs massively. So no one gives much of a toss what the UK thinks anymore since it left the EU. But Germany and France are going to have a big influence. And obviously, if we see an engagement with China, people are going to have to raise issues like the absolutely atrocious treatment of the Uyghur minority by China, and issues like Hong Kong and Taiwan. So it's going to be, you're going to have compromise approaches to China, but we have to avoid a really dangerous escalation of the division between the Western world and China, because nobody is going to come out of it well if that continues.
It's I mean, for me at least, it's very worthy of attention that when you cite the group of the Iron Man, which I have to say, you made this podcast for Audible that is, I have to recommend it to everyone. It's very good.
Thank you very much.
But you put it on the same group. You put Duterte from Philippines. You put Bolsonaro from Brazil, Modi from India, Orbán from Hungary. But you Erdogan from Turkey, and you mentioned, and you of course have a whole chapter on this, Boris Johnson.
Yes.
And my question is about the British institutions and strength as a system, as a democracy. And do you think that Boris Johnson is putting that to a test?
I certainly do. I think Johnson, remember, the criterion is you get in democratically and then you start to undermine that. He's already undermined Parliament. He has done immense damage to Britain's international relationship by having signed an agreement with the European Union called the Withdrawal Agreement about how we leave the European Union, and then passing a law which actually says we don't care about that agreement, we're going to ignore it and do something else. So he is moving away from democratic norms. And within the United Kingdom itself, this probably doesn't make the news outside the UK as much as the relationship with Europe. He has threatened the power of judges and the judiciary. He has threatened and undermined the power of Parliament. He's made it plain, or at least his main advisor, Dominic Cummings, has, that he wants to do something about the BBC. And so there are, and also he has criticized and is trying to change the civil service. So yes, he is accruing power into Westminster and overriding those checks and balances which are so important to our democracy. And as a consequence, incidentally, and I'm not sure how well known this is outside of the United Kingdom, he is accelerating the process of fragmentation inside the United Kingdom. And so we have now a very powerful movement for independence in Scotland. And he has also endangered the peace in Northern Ireland, which has not seen any significant violence since 1997. And our worst fears are that Johnson and his Brexit policy are going to lead to the troubles in Northern Ireland flaring up again, and we will see violence again. So he is, through his willful and undemocratic politics, he is really wrecking this country.
And if you have all these problems or menaces to democracy represented by people, by authorities that were elected democratically, do you think that we should work or rethink on the concept of democracy in terms of going beyond just the voting and institutions that are, apparently not so strong to withhold all these attempts?
Well, again, a very good question, Francisco. This, of course, what we haven't mentioned, except rather obliquely when discussing Russia, is the impact of the internet and social media. And the fact that you have a US Congresswoman who's been elected, who is a believer in the QAnon conspiracies, and who believes that the world is controlled by a mysterious clique of pedophiles, who believes in Pizzagate and all these other mad conspiracies, elected to the Assembly of the United States. This is absolutely shocking, and social media clearly has a lot to answer for on this. It's a complex consequence of technological innovation, which we've been unable to absorb and anticipate the consequences, combined with 30 or 40 years, and Chile is very important in this, because Chile was, of course, with the Pinochet coup, the laboratory for neoliberalism. We are seeing the combination of uncontrolled technological innovation with the absolute failure of neoliberalism, and the consequences, this populism that we're seeing around the world, anti-scientific, anti-rational, anti-intellectual, and it really does fertilize the ground for authoritarianism, and the authoritarianism in countries like China and Russia are only strengthened and boosted by this.
Mm-hmm. Well, we are getting to the end of this conversation, but I have to, I don't know if I have to ask you or maybe beg you for just a little bit of optimism, if there is any in you, about the outcome of all
so
this.
Yes, I know. Yeah, you're right. I've been very, very pessimistic, and I am a pessimist given the current situation. However, I still believe that human culture has created so many amazing things and has so many astonishing achievements to its credit already, that until we reach the tipping point, and that's tipping point on climate change, I know we have the intellectual, the spiritual, the material culture to overcome this. But we are reaching a critical moment, because on climate change, once we cross that point, there's no turning back. As it happens, I think that we are seeing the receding of the influence of authoritarianism at the moment. In several countries, in Britain, in Hungary, in Turkey, authoritarians are becoming more desperate as a consequence. But there is still that opportunity that the democratic, rational Enlightenment spirit will see us through this. But we have to act very, very quickly, and we have to act together.
Is there any country or leader that you look with some hope on this?
Yes, I think Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand is absolutely astonishing. I think the political leadership in Taiwan, when confronted with the pandemic, were astonishing. And if you look at those people, especially in the first phase, even in Europe, who did well with the pandemic, they all had female leaders. Now, I'm not saying that female leaders are the solution to all of our problems, but it is really striking that their ability to manage political risk, social risk, and medical risk has been significantly better than these loud, shouty, middle-aged white men, largely, who think that they're entitled to rule the world, even when their democratic mandates are taken away. So yes, Jacinda Ardern, I would say at the moment, is a remarkable political leader, and long may she reign in New Zealand.
Misha Glenny, thank you very much for all this. It's been very interesting, and we hope to have you physically here at some point.
I very much hope it as well. I cannot wait to come to Chile. Thank you very much, Francisco.
Nosotros nos despedimos de ustedes también, cerramos esta actividad. Muchísimas gracias por acompañarnos y los invito a seguir disfrutando y reflexionando con todas las actividades que tiene preparado este Festival Puerto de Ideas de Valparaíso. Muchas gracias.